Using a halftone of lines is another great way of adding texture to an otherwise simple logo design. Now, these lines can be used for both text or image-based illustrations for your logos, but let's see how we can apply this and create these kind of lines and styles, and then what we can do with them. First of all, to create this row or segment of lines, I'm going to use my line segment tool, and we're going to set our fill color to be none, with a stroke color, in this case, of white. Now, in order for you to see it, I'm going to work outside on the gray area on top of my artboard, and all I've got to do is to create one simple line. You can make it a little bit thicker, so you can play around with the thickness of it, but holding down the Option key when I click and drag with my selection tool will make a copy of it. I can then do Command D and create a series of duplicates of that copy. From here, now I've got a block of lines that I can play around with to see what it looks like on top of my logo. As you can see, once you place it on there, it's a great, simple, quick way of adding line work. I could play around with the placement of the lines, making sure it either lines up appropriately with parts of the logo. I can play around now with the thickness of the lines, making them more or less thick, or I can even bring them closer together, making them more or less dense. So with the lines themselves, you have a lot of flexibility on how you can approach them and how you can apply it to your logo's design. You can also apply it to not just the entire logo, but parts of a logo. In this case, I can emphasize one part of a design or make another stand out just by adding some contrast in those two textures. In addition to this, you can play around with these styles of line not being uniform. By starting off with thinner lines and then having them gradually get thicker, this creates kind of a gradation effect. And all I had to do was just change the size of each one just slightly as I created new ones. Placing this on top of a logo design, let's bring it to the front, now gives it the feel that my logo is fading out or fading in to that particular design or on top of it. And again, it's a simple, nice trick that also works really, really well when you're only having to deal with one or a few colors. It doesn't have to be stuck with just horizontal lines. Do know that you can take this same technique and we can rotate it. Let's rotate it to have like maybe a vertical style with it. And it would look something like this. So there's another thing that would work well with this. In addition to doing that, you don't have to have just parallel lines. Make a copy of these off to the side. Whoops, excuse me, let's do this. I'm going to bring them down just a bit. If you wanted to play around with the warping of your lines, you can select the entire group of lines that you've created, go up to Object, down to Envelope, Distort, and Make with Warp. These warp options give you the ability to change up a variety of different styles, and then you can play around with the amount of bend and horizontal and vertical distortion. Some of these are going to look better than others, but once you get kind of a style that you like, we can say OK to it, then you can make a copy of your logo and see what this style would look like. Let's again put it on top of the white background, and that just gives it an extra level of dimension and also some movement throughout your logo design. So for this first prompt, when I ask you to use simple lines, this is what I'm asking you to do. Create a set of lines, choose a pre-existing logo design or style that you have. It can be text-based, it could be more of an illustrative type, and then apply those lines on top and play around with what you can do with those simple lines. Now for the next set of prompts, we're going to be jumping out of Illustrator and working with Photoshop to tweak our current designs and even some imagery that you've researched. To get started, I'm going to work with one of my pre-existing text designs. This is one that I didn't choose. Let's see if we can take this particular design and tweak it just a bit to maybe push it into a different dimension or a different way of looking at it. So to get started, I'm going to jump into Photoshop, and we're going to create a new document. The size of this document needs to be measured, of course, in inches, and it needs to be a 5 by 5 area. Now the resolution of it is going to be relatively low at 100 pixels per inch, but we're going to keep it at RGB color mode and with a background of being solid white. When we say create, this is what we'll work with. Now, I can jump from Illustrator and I'm going to copy my selection, jump back into Photoshop, and I'm going to paste it. When you bring this in for this particular prompt, we do want to bring it in as a smart object. We'll say OK to this. This smart object will save a copy of it, and so any changes that we do to this can easily be undone if in case we need to make a mistake or go back and make another further tweaking. So with it pasted on here, pay attention to your layers. In this layer, we've got a smart object, smart vector object of our logo's design. What we want to do is to blur it out just slightly. If you go up to Filter, you've got a variety of different blurs you can play around with. Each one is going to give you some slightly different results, so play around with any one of these. For the sake of time, I'm going to use the Gaussian blur because this is the simplest one. With Gaussian blur, you can see it does just a basic out-of-the-box kind of blur around the entire edges. Now, as I increase the radius, it becomes less readable. If I kept it too low, you really don't see the effect. So depending on your design, you want to blow this out just enough to where you start to not be able to see the edges or they start to run together. And I think this looks pretty good for what I've got for my design. I'll say OK to it. And again, if you need to make changes to this because it's a smart object, you can always click on this Gaussian blur and go back to that and make another change to it. Now the downside to this is that I have a fuzzy edge. Now I want to be able to clean it up to have a nice hard edge and see what tweaks I can make with it. At the bottom of your Layers panel, click on the Transform options, which is the little rounded one in the center, and choose Threshold. This is going to add a threshold transformation to the topmost layer, and in your Properties panel, you can adjust the amount of light and dark for this threshold. Notice now when I do this, it's going to start to add on or eat away at my design. And this kind of gives it a multiple, little bit more of a harder edge or a grungy style and feel. Once you get something that you like, you can then go up to File, and let's do Save a Copy. Saving a copy, I'm going to do it to my computer, will give me the ability to save this in the format of a JPEG. So I'm going to call this Idiom 2. With that JPEG saved, I still have all of my layers that I can keep tweaking from my original document, but now I can bring in this other design and I can place it within all of the squares that I have inside of here. Let's play around with some of the other blurs that we've got. So I'm going to remove my threshold for now, deleting that layer. I'm also going to remove my Gaussian blur by dragging it to the trash can. So now I'm back to my regular smart object. And let's go up to Filter, down to Blur. Let's do a Spin Blur. With these in the blur gallery, this allows you to place exactly where you want the blur to be. So maybe if you only wanted part of the logo to look like it's spinning. I'm going to place mine right on top of my O and see if I can play around with the radius to get it to look like it's spinning with the O as being part of the area. Here we are. Let's see if I can make it larger. That looks good. And then we can bring in the amount of blur for each one. That's looking good for there. Once I'm done with this, I can hit OK at the very top. And then let's add on our threshold transformation. Again, play around with the look and feel of it, and you can see it adds kind of a unique funness to it. So maybe sometimes you'll get some results that work really well, maybe sometimes you won't. But in this case, maybe it gives me something like this. If I don't like it, I can always trash my design, and I can keep playing around with other ones. So for prompt number 2, using the Photoshop blur and distortion of those filters, that's what we're doing for this one. For the third prompt, let's use some of our visual research and see what this can do to an image that we've created or found. So I've gone in and I've tried to find some images that fit well for my brand or I think I could use for my designs. In this case, let's say I wanted to take this hand and turn this into a simple illustration that can be done quickly and turned into black and white. So all I'm going to do is to place it into my Photoshop document. I can scale it up and size it however I need. And remember, when you place an image in your layers panel, it'll automatically come in as a smart object. Now, in this case, we want to rasterize this layer. So holding down Control, or you can simply right-click on the layer, you can tell it to rasterize the layer, and this will allow us to actually edit the original pixels. That's what we want to do. You'll see why. With the image placed, let's go down and add our threshold filter. And again, in the Properties panel, this is where you can play around with the light and dark point to pick up on how far you want to take this image. Now obviously if I go too far, it's going to fill it in solid with a solid black. I want to have something, I like the look of, say, right about here, so I can get some of the shadows, but I'm losing some of the highlight edges on this one. So here's how we're going to bring back those highlighted edges. When you select your image layer, this will allow you to use your dodge and burn tools in your toolbox. The burn tool works much like a regular Photoshop brush. This allows you to select a certain range of tones and you can play around with the exposure of it. But I'm going to keep my exposure relatively low. I can click on an area and that will darken in all of the pixels in that area. And this is a great simple way of quickly and easily bringing back details that may otherwise be lost in this threshold process. If you go too far and make a mistake, or if you want to lighten up an area, this is where the dodge tool comes in. With the dodge tool, it works the exact opposite. It's going to lighten up an area. And again, it works just like a brush so that you can play around with the look and feel of those. So working back and forth between dodging and burning it is a great way of adding on details that may be lost in this process. Hey, if I was to turn off the threshold layer, you can see here where it's starting to darken in all of those pixels to give me this final result. Again, once you get your image the way you like it, you can always go up to File and save a copy. I'm going to call this Hand. And make sure you're saving it in a JPEG format. And we'll say OK to this. Now since this was done, I can bring this into, here's my hand, my Illustrator document. And I just worked on an image, so now I can take this and I can start to add maybe a typographic element to it as well. So I can take one of my pre-existing designs, place it, let's put it on white background, and now I've got an image and some typography that goes along with the design. Let's do one more using this particular technique. Jumping back into Photoshop, whoops, excuse me. Once I'm done with this, let's just go ahead and erase both of the layers. Let's place another image. This works really well for photographs or for other images. Let's see if I got my little globe that I was going to work with. Yeah, this one. Now in this case, if I bring in this one, I don't necessarily want all of this background. So the first thing that I'm going to do is to rasterize my layer. You can use either your white paintbrush or you could use the eraser and erase away all of the pixels. I'm going to use my eraser just for the sake of time. There is a magic wand eraser that makes it a little bit easier to pick up on like colors. Just be sure you don't go too far and accidentally undo it. But with the eraser tool, this allows me to quickly and easily erase away my area to get rid of it. With that done, now let's apply our threshold adjustment layer. I can play around with the lights and darks until I get what I like. But if I need to darken in some other edges, just make sure you select your image layer. Use your burn tool, and I can burn in where I want the edge of my globe to start to show up. If you make a mistake or go too far, swap over to your dodge tool, and this is where you can start to lighten up those areas. And again, you can play around with the range and have it affect only shadows or midtones or highlights. And the exposure kind of depends on how fast it's going to go as you start to use this particular image. Once we're done, let's save it up now as a JPEG on your computer. and place that within your other prompts. The final prompt deals with a combination of effects and filters that you can use within Photoshop. So again, I'm going to get rid of all of my layers until I'm back down to here, and I want to be able to work in just black and white for these designs. To change my color mode from RGB to CMYK, you can go up to Image, down to Mode, and choose Grayscale. Now this may ask you if you want to discard it, and we'll discard it. If it asks you to flatten your image, you can also say to flatten or not flatten, as long as we've got just a background layer. Now that we've got everything in just grayscale, if I were to take one of my pictures, let's say this picture, and place it inside of my design, automatically it's going to be converted to a black and white image, and that's going to work out really, really good. Now when working with these filters, we want this image to be on just one solid layer. So once I've placed everything onto it, we can go up to go up to Layer and down to Flatten Image to flatten it within your layers. From here, we can play around with the filters in our filter gallery. Go up to Filter, Gallery, and the filter gallery gives you a variety of different artistic style filters you can apply to your design. Some of these are going to work better than others. You can see I've got the sketch ones opened, and this is applying more of a photocopy style of it. If I wanted it to look like a charcoal rendering, I can also play around with the settings for these. The settings are usually found over here on the far right hand side, and there's no one particular way that I can work with it. I just have to know what my image looks like and how it best fits. The artistic ones give you the ability to make it look like it's a painting, but to be honest, sometimes these work best if you've got color already applied to it. Just the black and white may not be enough. In my case, if you wanted to do multiple ones, like I kind of like this cutout. If I wanted to, let's do some more levels. Simpler edges. And let's add one more style to this design. I'm going to go down to the very bottom and add on another cutout. But in this case, I'm going to change it over to maybe a charcoal style, halftone rendering. Ooh, halftone looks really good. And now I can play around with the light and dark textures for it. This looks great. Once you get a style that you like, you can say OK. Because this is not a smart object, this will apply it directly to the layers that I already have. And just like the others, I can now save this up as a JPEG on my computer. We'll call it Face. And I can place this within my selections as well. Just know when you do place them inside of here, pair it up with some text or some other designs that you've already created so that it reads well as one solid logo. Let's do it with this Go Lingo. So now I've got another option ready to go for this design. We'll bring it to the front and I can group those together. So this is a great simple way of adding halftoning and using bitmapped Photoshop filters and applying those to your graphic design logo designs.